Many years ago, in the beautiful town of Iron, there lived a man named Obaseki. Obaseki was not like most men. Unlike others his age, who worked as carpenters, bricklayers, or in similar trades, Obaseki sold food on the streets. He was a food vendor who owned a local restaurant, fondly referred to as a mama spot. There, he sold all types of delicious delicacies to the people of Iran. Obaseki was very popular. Despite being a man in a line of work typically dominated by women, he had numerous customers every single day. This success made his neighbors, Aishatu and Bashira, who also sold food on the same street, incredibly jealous. They couldn't understand how a man could have long queues of people waiting to buy his food, while they, as women, had only a few customers. Determined to uncover his secret, Bashira decided to investigate. She sent one of her friends to secretly buy Obaseki's food, hoping to discover what was so special about it. To her surprise, the friend reported that there was nothing particularly extraordinary about the taste. In fact, Bashira believed her own food was even more delicious. Despite this, Bashira's business was slowly failing because of Obaseki's growing popularity. She couldn't afford for that to happen. She had too many mouths to feed and responsibilities to take care of. Desperate, Bashira devised a plan. She invited her niece, who lived in a neighboring state, to come and stay with her. The idea was to have her niece secure a job at Obaseki's restaurant, allowing her to serve as a spy. Bashira hoped that her niece could uncover Obaseki's secret and help her implement it in her own business before he completely drove her and the other women out of the food trade. Obaseki was very happy because his restaurant was incredibly successful. There was never a dull moment in his establishment. Everyone wanted to buy food from him. Both the rich and the poor flocked to his restaurant. It was a common sight to see wealthy people, dressed in expensive clothes, parking their cars, and struggling for a plate of food at Obaseki's restaurant. This happened despite there being other, supposedly better places to eat in town. Obaseki's joy knew no bounds. He was married and had 3 beautiful wives, but interestingly, he did not allow them to come to his restaurant. He had forbidden them, saying, "For Adola, on no account should you ever come to my restaurant during the day. On no account should you eat the food that I sell at my restaurant. Lastly, on no account should you reveal anything I have told you to anyone. It is for your own good. A word is enough for the wise." His wives, Adola and Bai, wondered why their husband would not allow them to eat the food he sold, or at least help him at the shop, especially given the large crowds he attracted. However, they did not dwell too much on it, as Obaseki provided well for them. Fashade, on the other hand, was deeply concerned. She noticed that her husband had changed drastically, particularly after the death of their only child. Things had not always been this way. They had not always been wealthy, and Obaseki had not always been a restaurant owner. In fact, there was a time when Fashad was his only wife, and life was much simpler. Obaseki had once been a bus driver and lived in extreme poverty. Their only child, O, became very sick, and they were too poor to afford proper medical care. Even though Obaseki sold everything he owned, including his bus, in a desperate attempt to save his son, O still passed away. O's death had a profound effect on Obaseki. He had shared a very strong bond with his son, their only child, and the loss left him devastated. After O's death, Obaseki underwent a complete transformation. He locked himself indoors for days, weeping and crying inconsolably. Fashade, his wife, was deeply worried about him. After some days of isolation, Obaseki abruptly left for his hometown, Isa. When he returned, he surprised everyone by opening a restaurant. Within just 3 months, the restaurant became wildly successful, making him the #1 food vendor in the whole of Iron. However, Fashad found this sudden turn of events deeply unsettling. Not only had her husband never known how to cook, not even simple dishes like white rice, He had always been vocal about his disdain for polygamy. Yet, he had gone on to marry 2 more wives after O's death. Fashade tried multiple times to talk to her husband about these changes and her concerns, but Obaseki refused to listen to her. He seemed distant and resolute, leaving her feeling helpless and confused. Something inside Obaseki had died after the loss of his son, O. However, outwardly, he seemed very happy. He was now wealthy, and his business was thriving. Although Obaseki was not the one who actually cooked the food, after his staff finished preparing the meals, he would send them all to the front of the shop to pray for sales. While they prayed, he would go inside to where the food was and add his secret sauce before it was served to the public. When people passed by his shop in the morning and saw his staff praying, they assumed his success was due to his prayerfulness. Little did they know it was his secret ingredient that made all the difference. Things continued like this for a while. Meanwhile, Bashira's niece, Fomi, had traveled all the way from Sango to Iran to spy on Obaseki. Fomi was a very beautiful young woman who always attracted attention wherever she went. Upon her arrival, Bashira had already arranged a 1-room apartment for her to live in. This was to ensure she didn't blow her cover. If she were seen coming from Bashira's house, Obaseki might suspect her and fire her. Fomi applied for a job at Obaseki's restaurant and was hired. Every day she went to work and tried to uncover his secrets. She asked many questions and kept a close eye on everything. That's when she started noticing peculiar details. Although Obaseki never participated in cooking the food and didn't even arrive early to the restaurant, no food was ever served to customers until he showed up. Despite the fact that customers would be waiting eagerly and the food was ready, everything paused until Obaseki arrived. Each time he came, Each day, Obaseki would arrive at the restaurant with a bag, head straight to the kitchen where the food was kept, and shut the door behind him. Inside, he would pour a white, cream-like substance into all the different pots and coolers of food, stirring gently to ensure it dissolved completely. Only after this process would his staff be allowed to start serving the food to the eager customers. Fomi observed all of this and reported her findings to her aunt, Bashira. Fomi, you need to dig deeper, Bashira said, her eyes narrowing with determination. Find out exactly what he does with that food behind closed doors. I'm sure he's adding something that makes him sell like crazy. While this investigation continued, Fashade was growing increasingly worried about her husband's strange behavior since the death of their son. Obaseki had a secret room in their house that no one, not even Fashade, was allowed to enter. She had tried many times to find out what was inside, but Obaseki guarded the key to the room carefully, even sleeping with it under his pillow. It seemed impossible for anyone to gain access. Determined to uncover his secret, Fashade devised a plan. One day, after Obaseki had entered the secret room as usual, Fashade suddenly ran outside, screaming, "Fire! Fire! The house is burning! Fire!" Hearing her cries, Obaseki dashed out of the room in a panic. Forgetting to lock the door in his rush, Obaseki ran out of the room to investigate the supposed fire. Seizing the opportunity, Fashade sneaked into the room. To her disappointment, the room looked as ordinary as any other in the house. She had expected the worst from her husband, fearing he might be involved in some kind of ritualistic activity. She had envisioned finding dead bodies or blood-stained floors, but instead there was nothing unusual. Though initially disappointed, Fashade felt a wave of relief. At least her worst fears were unfounded. As she was about to leave the room, her eyes caught sight of a stack of bottles in the corner. She immediately recognized them. They were the same type of bottles that her husband brought home from work every single day. Obaseki always insisted on washing these bottles himself, never allowing any of his wives to touch them. Curious, Fashade wondered What was so important about these bottles that her husband would keep them locked away in a secret room? She decided to open one of them. To her utter shock, she discovered that the bottle contained her husband's bodily fluids, his manly essence. What? Why is Obaseki bottling this? She wondered, her mind racing. What could he possibly be doing with it? Why does he take it to the restaurant every single day? Her thoughts were interrupted by the realization that Obaseki would soon discover the fire was a false alarm. Fashadi quickly left the room, her heart pounding. She couldn't stop pondering the mystery. What on earth could her husband be doing with those bottles? Could this be why none of us, his wives, have ever gotten pregnant for him? Fashad wondered, her mind racing. Yet, he doesn't seem bothered. He doesn't even pressure us or threaten us about giving him children. I must get to the root of this matter, she resolved, her determination growing stronger. Meanwhile, Fomi was also setting her own plan in motion to uncover what Obaseki did behind closed doors with the food. One day, as usual, all the staff arrived at work, completed the cooking, and waited for their boss to inspect the food before serving it, despite the growing crowd outside. Fomi saw her chance and quietly sneaked into the room where the food was kept. She hid inside one of the cupboards, waiting patiently for Obaseki to arrive. A few minutes later, Obaseki entered the room, completely unaware of her presence. Believing he was alone, he opened a small bottle and poured a creamish, whitish substance into one of the pots of food. As Fomi watched, her eyes widened in shock. Unable to contain herself, she screamed and jumped out of her hiding spot. Obaseki was stunned, frozen in place as his eyes met Fomi's. His face was a mix of fear and anger. "What are you doing here?" he shouted, his voice trembling. But Fomi wasn't listening. She ran toward the door, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Everybody come and see. This man is using juju to sell his food. Come and see." Her voice carried outside, and within seconds, a crowd began to gather. Customers, staff, and passers-by stormed into the restaurant, eager to see what the commotion was about. Obaseki's employees and customers, who had come to buy food, rushed into the room. They were all shocked to see Obaseki frozen in place, holding a small bottle containing a creamish, whitish substance. The room fell silent as Fomi stopped shouting and began explaining what had transpired. "I've noticed the unusual crowd that gathers at this restaurant every day," Fomi began, her voice steady but loud enough for all to hear. "I also noticed that before we're allowed to sell the food to customers, my boss, Obaseki, always comes into this store where the food is kept. He shuts the door and stays alone with the food. I always wondered what he was doing, so I decided to investigate." She paused as the crowd leaned in closer, hanging on her every word. "I hid inside the cabinet, and what I saw shocked me. He brought out a bottle from his bag and poured its contents into the food. That's why I screamed," Fomi finished, her eyes blazing with anger. "It's a lie! A lie!" Obaseki shouted, his voice shaky. "She's lying. She's only trying to tarnish my name and ruin my business." He looked visibly scared, his words doing little to convince the growing crowd. "Then what's inside that bottle, Obaseki?" one of his customers, Chuki, asked, stepping forward. "Nothing. It's nothing. It's just my secret sauce," Obaseki stammered. "It's not juju. As a matter of fact, it's simply milk mixed with herbs and spices." "Okay then," another customer interjected, arms crossed. "If it's just milk and spices, why don't you take a sip? After all, you're putting it in the food you sell to us." Obaseki stammered, refusing to drink from the bottle. By now, a large crowd had gathered, all staring at him with suspicion. The tension in the room reached its peak when one of his customers suddenly snatched the bottle from his hand. They removed the lid, brought it close to their nose, and recoiled in disgust. "What is this?" they screamed, passing the bottle around. Another customer took a sniff of the bottle and recoiled, exclaiming, Is this what I think it is? This smells like a man's fluid." As soon as the words left Chuki's mouth, the crowd erupted in anger. People lunged at Obaseki, grabbing him and beating him furiously. "Why would you give us food cooked with that? Do you know how disgusting this is? Why did you do it?" They screamed as the mob grew increasingly violent. Obaseki, overwhelmed and bloodied, began to shout, "I will confess. Please stop beating me. I'll confess, I swear. Please forgive me." His desperate cries brought a momentary halt to the beating as the crowd gathered closer to hear what he had to say. By this time, news of the commotion had reached his wives at home. They rushed to the restaurant, horrified by what they had heard, and arrived just as Obaseki began his confession. Tears streamed down his face as he started to speak. "It all started when my son, died," Obaseki began, his voice trembling. "Many of you know how much I loved O. I came to so many of you, begging for help, pleading for money to pay for my son's hospital bills so he wouldn't die. But you didn't help me. None of you did. My son died, and I was shattered, heartbroken." Obaseki paused to catch his breath, looking around at the stunned faces in the crowd. "That was when I made up my mind. I never wanted to be poor again. And I wanted revenge against all of you, the people of Uragon, who abandoned me in my time of need." The crowd gasped as he continued. "I met a man, Baba Jessa. I told him what I wanted: wealth, success, and a way to punish those who turned their backs on me. Baba Jessa agreed to help me, but it came at a price. After making some sacrifices, he told me to use my fluid, my manly essence, in the food I cooked. He said it would bring me wealth and power, and as long as people ate my food, they would keep coming back, unable to resist, and I would continue to prosper. People who eat my food will eventually come down with one terminal illness or another and die. It's only a matter of time," Obaseki confessed, looking deeply repentant. At his words, the crowd erupted in panic and anger. "Ah, this man has killed me!" a customer screamed. "Do you know I eat this man's food every single day?" "Me too," another customer cried. "My children even take his food to school every day." "This man is pure evil," someone shouted. "So because you asked people for money when your son was sick and they didn't give you, and your son died, you decided to destroy an entire community? Eh? Is there anyone in this town who hasn't eaten your food? Should we all die because your son died?" Someone in the crowd yelled, "You will join your son today." And with that, the mob's fury boiled over. They picked up stones and began pelting Obaseki. Seeing the mob's violent reaction, Obaseki's wives, Fashade, Adola, and Bai, realized they were also in danger. They quickly sneaked out of the crowd and ran away for their lives. They knew that after the mob was done with Obaseki, they would likely come after them next. Within a few minutes, Obaseki succumbed to the beating and fell to the ground, lifeless. His bloodied body lay still as the mob turned their attention elsewhere. Their anger wasn't sated yet. Someone shouted, "Burn his restaurant to the ground." The mob immediately acted on this, destroying the building that had once been the most popular eatery in Iron. Flames consumed the restaurant until it was reduced to ashes. Next, the mob proceeded to Obaseki's house, one of the finest in the area. They set it ablaze, leaving nothing but rubble and smoke behind. In the aftermath, the tragedy left a lasting scar on the community. No one in Iran ever bought food from restaurants again, not even from Bashira, who had orchestrated the plan by bringing her niece Fomi to spy on Obaseki. She too suffered as her business failed, and she had no choice but to close her restaurant. Bashira deeply regretted her actions. She realized that in trying to undermine Obaseki's business, she had unwittingly contributed to the downfall of all food vendors in Iran. To this day, no one in the community dares to open a restaurant. The memory of Obaseki's betrayal and its devastating consequences left the people of Iron deeply mistrustful, and the once thriving food trade in the town remains a thing of the past. The people of Iron had to go to great lengths to cleanse their land. They offered sacrifices and performed rituals to ensure there would be no outbreaks of disease and that their lives would be spared from the lingering effects of Obaseki's actions. Thank you so much for sticking with me and watching my story to the end. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. What do you think about Obaseki? Do you think he deserved to die, considering that his actions stemmed from a place of deep trauma? He was clearly devastated by the loss of his son and acted out of that pain. Does that justify his actions in any way? Also, what about Bashira? Do you think it serves her right that her shop eventually closed and she lost her business? After all, she did play a part in this unfortunate chain of events. Lastly, have you ever suspected anyone of using jazz or charms to boost their sales, especially when you see unusually large crowds at their shop or restaurant? I'd love to hear your stories or thoughts in the comments section. Please don't forget to support my channel by subscribing, liking my videos, and sharing them with your loved ones. Your support means so much to me.